From aboard the Onyx, off Aestrin Abbey. Dearest wife, you would not recognise the Onyx now. Her appearance has changed quite a bit from when you and the boys stood atop the cliffs, waving your little white handkerchiefs as I disappeared around the headland. She is no longer a small jib cog, but is rather now more in line with a sloop. Although I did decide on keeping the 9-yard square sail for when going downwind and the like, I'm sure you understand. Anyway, I'm on my way to Aestrin Abbey and closing upon the island, beating up into quite a solid westerly wind, coming almost directly from the island in fact, and the sea has on occasion almost picked up. But with the Onyx's new rig, I'm sure I shall arrive in the morning, for the sun is beginning to dip. I know the postal service does visit the abbey, and so I'm hoping to send this off from the landing area, and you should hopefully get it within the next couple of days. I hope at some point to visit the island of Eastwind. You remember Eastwind, my dear? Of course you do. It was after all you that spotted it on our escape journey from the kingdom. You almost certainly saved our lives that day, and the lives of our children, sweetheart. How you were able to pick out the islands in that fog I do not know, but it was a wonderful stroke. But then it had to be, or else we would have sailed straight past the islands in the Duchy of Aestrin and ended out in open sea where we would have certainly been lost and never to be seen again. Anyway, I'm carrying crates of tobacco and gems to the abbey. I've only ever been here once before, a long time ago with my father, and I do seem to recall a rather windy, narrow passage up to the landing area. But once you're in, you're quite sheltered, and so I'll likely finish this letter off in the morning, and hope to see you again very soon. Cheerio now, my darling. William decided not to tell his wife, in his letter, that he'd already started buying equipment used for navigating across open stretches of ocean. Specifically, a sun compass in this case, but was already laying down the foundations for going abroad, as he called it. William and his wife had discussed this eventuality, or rather argued over it, with she insisting that he should play it safe, sail the seas around the Aestrin Islands, not go abroad to faraway archipelagos. But William knew the quickest way to get the wealth they needed to survive was to go far abroad, on far more lucrative trade routes. William had been contemplating this when a vessel appeared. Having not been paying attention to where he was going on account of writing his letter, he had not seen it until he was almost on top of it. A very small sloop of some kind, a wreck of course, bottles and debris strewn across the ocean. William very quickly reefed his sails and dove into the water. Maybe there were survivors. But a quick look amongst the detritus showed that there were none, or if there were any, they were long gone by now. With one last final look, William decided to once again get back underway. But with the wind still coming off the islands, his destination at Aestrin Abbey, he was in for what he suspected was a long night, tack upon tack, trying to beat up towards the island and gain access into one of the inlets. William, however, was very much aware of his inexperience as a mariner. The idea that William would have to find the entryway to the road, the inner road, in the dark, perhaps passing over a sandbar or even reefs and rocks, filled William with dread, and he hoped to gain the road via the main northern entrance. But with the wind thus, this would not be easy. In the very early hours, it had come on to blow. Rain had begun to fall, and the sea had begun to ripple. Before long, the southwesterly trade winds coming up from the direction of Al Ankh had blown a storm directly over Aestrin Abbey, and it took all of William's efforts just to hold his position in the ocean where he was. His instinct was to come about and flee, sailing fast before the storm, before the wind. He feared the ship broaching to, forcing the ship onto her beam ends, and thus capsizing and sinking rapidly. Or if not sinking, then being wrecked by the wave that would smash into the vessel. sending the cargo and equipment across the ocean, much that William had found in the night with the small sloop, capsized and wrecked without a survivor in sight. But for now, William decided he would try to weather the storm. His very slow progress during the night meant that his deadline for his delivery to Aestrin Abbey was fast approaching, and he could not afford to miss the deadline. And so with that in mind, he endeavoured to hold his position as best he could, and even went so far as to raise the gaffsail, hoping to give him better steerage way and better balance. But he also knew that all it would take was one strong wave or one strong gust of wind, and the ship could tip over onto its beam ends. With the gaffsail raised, William could now turn better into the wind, meeting the waves head on, and the wind now on the port bow rather than on the beam. But regularly, waves striking the vessel sent spray and water crashing across the deck. William was soaked to the skin, of course, and by this point he had been awake for the best part of 36 hours. He was exhausted, and the wind and rain showed no sign of abating as William decided to tack once again. Hours later, the storm finally passed by. William had gotten through the worst of it. The Onyx was still intact, her cargo still aboard, and she was on the starboard tack. The rain still fell in torrents, of course, and the sea was still whipping up. Now all he had to do was close with the island and gain entry into the sheltered roads at last. There had been many occasions during the last few hours that William had considered throwing overboard any cargo not on contract. But he had held his nerve, using his own body weight to balance the ship when necessary, running from port beam to the starboard beam, depending upon the tack of course. But his exhaustion was getting the better of him, and he felt that he could not keep this up for much longer. It was high tide at one of the entryways that led to the sheltered roads up to the landing area and the abbey, and it was towards this that William sailed the Onyx, hoping with all his might that the Onyx would sail clean over any sandbars or rocks there without any damage or a break in her pace. It looked like it was going to be a very close run thing. One, as to whether the Onyx would even get into the inner roads, and two, whether William could get the Onyx up to the landing zone and deliver his cargo on time. Time was running out. The delivery was due on this day, and William still had a fair way to go yet, and the wind was still very much against him. Crossing the sandbar, the Onyx lost a lot of her way, just about maintaining steerage way in fact, and William brushed the vessel against the sandy shore on the port side, before whipping the helm over to starboard, and resetting the jib on the port tack. This should be just about enough to get the Onyx into the inner roads, and indeed it was. William let out a huge sigh of relief, and setting the gaff sail, he now turned to port to bring the boat around towards the landing area. Of course, with Aestrin Abbey having a fairly sheltered anchorage, there was never much more than a moderate breeze, but slowly, over the rest of the day, William painstakingly brought his vessel up towards the landing area, completely exhausted, having not slept for the best part of 2 days. All that remained now was to very quickly moor up his vessel and unload it in double quick time, lest he miss his deadline. With the Onyx moored up, William decided he was going to hire the services of a cargo porter to unload the ship. And so, with the cargo delivered at last, William hired lodgings for the night and crashed out, falling into a fitful, haunted sleep. William had awoke with a start. He had dreamt that same dream once again, that nightmare. He knew he had been screaming out in his sleep. This was becoming a all too regular occurrence with him now, often waking up in terror, drenched in sweat, even on occasion having vomited during the night. The looks from the other people in the small inn, the other patrons, the staff, told him that they had heard him during the night. Some looked on in concern, others giving him a short, quizzical look as he passed them in the hall. Whilst asleep, his mind had transported him back to that terrible, horrifying day. The day in which the king's army had very nearly met total destruction. The enemy had shown no quarter, wading through the mud and blood on the battlefield, mud up to his knees, as what remained of his company was being withdrawn to the rear to join an ad hoc force under the personal command of the prince to hold open the small gap in the line, a gap that the very nearly entirely surrounded army would have to escape through. It would be a very close run thing, and casualties had been enormous. This was the battle in which William's dear childhood friend had died. The popular mariner, Captain Christopher, the captain who had left the Onyx to William in his will, with the kindly message that William was to sell the Onyx upon his return home. This would give him the finances he would need to keep his household afloat whilst he found work. Captain Christopher had been a very wise man. He had foreseen the state of the kingdom at the end of the war. He knew that jobs and finances would be very hard to come by in a kingdom partially ravaged by war and likely crippled by corruption, with ministers using the emergency powers assigned to them during the war to increase the size of their purses. And of course, it was only when William went to go sell the Onyx upon returning home that he realised that he had been cursed. And so he was left with the only option to use the Onyx to sail away from his troubles. And that is what he was attempting to do now. Sail away from his nightmares, his history, his memories. He longed for the happy family life, but he could not foresee a day that he would be granted this wish. But as he departed from Aestrin Abbey, he decided he would pay yet one more trip to Fort Aestrin to pick up a new cargo destined for Sarensong Island. He was going to spend a day with his family. He'd gotten out from the inner roads of Aestrin Abbey via a rather shoaly route, somewhat risky. It had not been intentional. He'd taken the wrong road, but getting out safely had prompted him to take up his mug, fill it full of mead that he'd bought from Aestrin Abbey, and share a drink with the gods of the sea, Aegir and his wife Ran, for having delivered him from the storm. He also shared a drink with Njord, thanking him for the bounty of the sea, which in William's opinion included the trade that was now his life's blood. The next day, at Fort Aestrin, William decided to add an additional gypsum to his vessel. These small additions here and there would eventually turn the Onyx into a proper ocean-going craft. That, of course, was William's hope and intention, at least anyway. He'd also begun the conversion of some of his money into pieces of gold rather than the Aestrin crowns that were used in the area. Vessels, boats, ships, etc. were bought using gold only, and moored up in Fort Aestrin was a small dinghy that William had his eyes on. This small craft would be the perfect tender for the Onyx. Towed astern, William could use it to row ashore or row against the wind if necessary to make deliveries or visit islands, whilst the Onyx remained anchored out in the ocean. Once again visiting the harbour master at Fort Aestrin, William bought up 2 barrels of honey beer to carry home to Sarensong. Not for his own consumption, of course, but to be sold there. "Very happy to see that you've survived the storm, Master Bertrand," the harbour master had said. "But forgive my impertinence, you do look quite destroyed, sir, quite knocked about. Well, so too would you, sir, if you'd been flung about in a 2-day storm. 2 rotten days, and hardly a wink of sleep in 4. I'm going home, sir. I need to see my family. I need to spend a day at least in peace. And hopefully, the next time you see me, I shall have the gold for buying that dinghy over there." Oh yes, a fine choice. William had taken his leave and sailed to the north, reaching Sarensong later that day as the sun at last began to dip in the western sky. Billy Bertrand the Younger, the harbour master at Sarensong had proclaimed as William had walked into his office. "It's been, 2 weeks now already? Glad to see you're still among the living." "Yes, only just, sir, only just. I honestly feel quite destroyed, in both body and mind." "Well, sir, welcome home nonetheless. Take a day or 2, reset yourself, and get back to it. That is how I used to operate. And with his cargo sold and delivered, William stood on the dock, looking up towards the cliff top, towards where his home currently stood. The last place he'd seen his wife and children, waving their little white handkerchiefs to him as he had sailed out to sea some 2 weeks earlier. He would be with them in a matter of minutes. He could not wait to see the looks on their faces as he walked through the door. Thank you ever so much for watching once again and listening to this little story in the game Sailwind. I really hope you enjoyed it. And at last we start to learn about some of the inner workings of poor old William's mind, for he is obviously a troubled soul. Anyway, look forward to more as William prepares both himself and his ship, the Onyx, for going abroad, away from the Aestrin Isles and of course his family, in an effort to get them a happy living that they so dream of. Cheerio for now.